And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hi everybody, and now for your marine forecast with the forecast issued Friday, April 11th. For our sea ice edge today, a couple of minor things. All the eastern side that you see there is ever so slightly increasing toward the south. And the reason is we've had a northerly wind regime going on in there and temperatures below freezing. Also, something the ice forecaster asked me to mention was that St. Paul and St. George may have some wind-driven ice strips early next week. So if that's a caution for you, please start to prepare for that situation. So for tonight's weather, we have a big cold upper low over that 998 millibar low that you see there in the Bering Sea. It's very, very cold aloft. In the long time that I've been forecasting up here, I don't recall having seen one that cold in April. Well, it's also helping to cause that 989 millibar low off of Sand Point to develop. And it's going to develop pretty quickly and merge with that 998, as you can see, to tomorrow's weather. Cold air. So I've drawn a couple of cold fronts there and then some warm front out in front of that developing low down to 982 millibars. Not the deepest low that you'd ever see at this time of year, but certainly deep. Plenty of wind around it, as you'll see in the forecast coming up here, and then a trough up through the interior. But the main thing to think of is generally southeasterlies on the warm side of it, switching around to southerlies behind the warm front, and then northerlies and northwesterlies on the back side of this low with plenty of cold air, which gives it a lot of gust factor. So on Sunday, now that low has moved up almost to the Kenai Peninsula, just south of Seward, 979 millibars, full occluded front around it, cold air in behind it, but the Gulf has warm water. So with the warm water out there and the very cold temperatures aloft, it would not surprise me at all to see some maritime lightning over the Gulf. So we're going to keep an eye on that for the next couple of days. Out behind it, quite a lot of cold air. All of the precipitation is snow, so plenty of snow showers and even snow squalls hitting the Bering side, hitting the Alaska Peninsula, and even some out into the Gulf of Alaska on the backside of that low. So, looking at Saturday's marine forecast for southeast Alaska. Winds on the inside, 10 to 20 knots. For Clarence Strait, up to 4 feet, otherwise 2 to 3 feet. On the outside waters, small craft advisories, wind ranging from 15 to up to 30 knots off of Cape Suckling, and the seas still in the single digits, around anywhere from 6 to 8 feet. And then on Sunday, we start to see a lot of response to the low that's developing in the Gulf. So on the inside waters, 25 to 30 knots, 2 mentions of gust of 40, and for Clarence Strait, seas built up to 11 feet, and then for the rest of the waters there, looking at about 6 to 7 feet or so as they build up. But on the outside, 30 knots down in the southern portions, but seas in the teens, seas 15 feet. And then as you get further north, gale force 35, seas up to 19 feet, and then when off of Cape Suckling, a gale 40 knots out of the east and seas 24 feet. So that's really formidable. For Saturday's marine forecast for the south central waters, starting up, we've got about 30 knots or so in the eastern sections. Small craft advisory, 25 knots, seas 4 feet in Prince William Sound. And then as we get closer over toward the developing low, wind ranges from 40 to 45 knots, and down off of Kennedy Entrance, storm force 50 knots, seas 14 feet, northeasterlies in Cook Inlet 25 to gale force 35 knots. So plenty of wind with this system. And then, like I said, what we're going to start to look out for is perhaps in the south part there, maybe some maritime lightning. And then on Sunday, which is even more likely for the lightning, winds up to whole gale, 45 knots off of the entrance down there to Cordova and Valdez, 17 feet, wind 40 knot and 18 feet down there, and plenty of gale force in that. 30 knots and seas 7 feet in Prince William Sound, 25 knot easterlies as you get down off the peninsula, including Kennedy Entrance, and then all of Cook Inlet, 25 knots, seas up to 7 feet. So for our Alaska Peninsula and Kodiak Island waters, you see that circulation around the developing low. Whole gales, 45 knots in the north part, around 35 knots, and definitely easterly component. And then as you get further to the west, northerly component in the winds, winds up to 25 to 30 knots and 35 knots off of Sand Point in that circulation around the developing low. And then on Sunday, again, expect that a chance of maritime lightning, particularly in the afternoon, down just outside of the areas that you see here, but still a possibility even as you get in closer to shore. So things coming around with a few westerlies to follow that low that's moving up toward Middleton Island. And then wind a whole gale of 40 knots, seas 11 feet down off of False Pass, and also off of Coal Bay on the Bering Sea side, seas up to 18 feet on the Bering Sea side, 15 to 25 knots as you get further up towards Bristol Bay, and seas 6 feet, and then 15 to 20 knots for off of Chignik and getting over towards Sitkinak Island. Now for our west coast, big surge out of the north, 40 knots in the east, and then really tapers off to 15 knots in the west, seas up to 13 feet for the Pacific side, and seas up to 14 feet for the Bering Sea side. Again, all westerly component in there too, plenty of snow squalls in that eastern section. And then as Sunday, as things start to really taper down, around 20 knots or so for most of the Aleutians, certainly in the west, and seas up to 9 feet. And then generally westerlies as you get further east, and seas well up into the teens, gale force off of Unalaska Island, seas at 18 feet, and then south of Unalaska also seas to 10 feet. For our west coast, on Saturday, generally northerlies. That's following that low pressure system down to the south. Winds from 20 knots up in Norton Sound, ramping up to 40 off of St. Matthew Island, and gale force 35 knots for the Pribilofs, 30 knots out of Bristol Bay. And then on Sunday, things are calming down a little bit. Norton Sound, 30 knots, and also off of Hooper Bay, 30 knots. And then as you get further south, start to see a little bit of westerly component, 30 knots, and then a little bit of easterly in Bristol Bay, 20 knots, seas 4 feet. For Saturday's marine forecast for the Arctic coast, polar easterlies persist, 20 to 25 knots out of the east. And even as you get over into the Chukchi Sea, more or less the same. Now down toward the Bering Strait, 10 to 15 knots until you get down to St. Lawrence Island, where we're small craft 25 knots, and again 20 knots out of Norton Sound. So for Sunday, the polar easterlies are strong off of Kaktovik, about 30, but they ramp down to about 10 knots as you get down off of Point Hope. And then 20 to 25 knots in the Bering Strait area, 25 knots off of Gambell, and then 30 knots in Norton Sound. So that's it for your marine forecast. Folks, please let folks know where you're going if you have to go out in the ocean. And please stay safe out there. Thank you.